Gur Magat Las Cairn Corla, and at the outset I want to send our sympathies to the families and friends of the young people who died and were injured in the horrific crash in Carlow last night. Such a shocking loss of so many young lives is devastating, and my thoughts are with them today. Taoiseach, I want to start with a quote. The story for people with disabilities continues to worsen year after year. Access to therapies is simply appalling, and respite care and opportunities for work for people with disabilities are very poor. The assessment of needs statutory rules are continuously breached. We also know that the government scrapped the mobility allowance and the motorised transport grant. We've been waiting for the new scheme for 4 years and 7 months, longer than the duration of the First World War. There is no excuse for this inertia and lack of progress. You might recognise those words, Taoiseach, because they were delivered by you in opposition during Leaders' Questions in October 2017. Leo Varadkar was the Taoiseach then too. Maybe you can help me and point to one single thing that has changed in the intervening 6.5 years other than you just entering government. The only thing that comes to mind is it has now been 11 years since those transport schemes were scrapped. Or to use your analogy, more than twice the duration of World War I. And still, there's no replacement. Is it any wonder that disabled people and parents of children with disabilities feel not just ignored by successive governments, but actively harmed? Because the consistent failure to provide basic supports isn't just some kind of an inconvenience, it's ruining people's lives. It prohibits early intervention, results in social isolation and increased rates of poverty, and ultimately prevents people from being able to live a full and independent life. Taoiseach, the delivery of disability services by this government can be summarised by one word: failure. The failure starts early, when children are left waiting for assessments and then denied access to essential therapies. And it continues throughout a person's life. When you can't access education, when you're locked out of employment, when you can't get nearly the amount of personal assistance hours you need, the list goes on and on and on. It's infuriating for people to listen to the same broken promises from successive governments for years. When you're in opposition, you made lots of commitments to improve services. What do you have to say about those commitments today? Taoiseach, tens of thousands of people are stuck on waiting lists. In fact, the only thing that disabled people are guaranteed access to in this country is a long waiting list. When is this going to change? My questions are: when will the Children's Disability Network teams be fully staffed? When will a new motorised transport grant be introduced? And when will you ratify the optional protocol of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities?
Could I first of all say, you asked the question what has changed or what has developed. But I'll just take the education area alone. In terms of education, there's been very significant development since this government was formed. 7 special schools have now been established, and 5 of those are up and running. And that was something that we focused on very, very quickly in terms of special education, because prior to that there hadn't been the establishment of special schools, 2 in particular in the Cork area and a third underway. And also there's been a very significant increase in respect of special needs assistants working in our schools, over and above what was a very significant scheme, a scheme that I introduced back in 1998. I've had a lifelong interest in special needs education, and I'm very keen that we continue to improve resources. About 20,045 special education teachers will now be available for allocation to schools in 2024. That's 20% compared with 2019-2020 of an increase, when the number was at 16,626. And by the end of this year, there'll be 21,584 special needs assistants available to schools. That's an increase of over 35%. So there has been difference. There have been improvements in some areas of special needs provision. Back in 2019-2020 school year, that number stood at 15,000. So from 15,000 to 21,000 SNAs is a significant degree of progress on that front. And about 51,000 children participated in the summer programme last year, which was an increase of 300% over the 2019 figure, and about 389 new special classes for this year, which gives us about 1,300 new special classes sanctioned over the last 4 years. And there was an agreement for the Section 39 pay funding was reached in October, which had been raised in this particular House. And then in terms of the overall, in terms of the health side of it and disability, 700 million extra has been invested in disability between 2018 and 2023. 5 million hours of home support will be delivered this year in personal assistance and home support services. The Children's Disability Services, about 800 whole-time equivalent posts in the Children's Disability Network teams in recent years has been provided for in additional funding. 350 of those posts have been filled. There are issues around staffing vacancies due to staff movement. Remaining DNT posts are at various stages of recruitment. People on disability allowance, blind pension, invalidity pensions are now €29 better off per week since the government took office. And then we brought a range of cost of living supports for the disability services in the cost of living package. And in respect of the Disabled Drivers and Disabled Passenger Scheme, which provides relief from VRT and VAT on the use of an adapted car, as well as an exemption from motor tax, about 80 million is provided. There is a new scheme being developed. The senior officials group is meeting to bring that to a conclusion.
Taoiseach, I'm going to start with a quote again. There is a very disappointing complacency, almost smugness, in the response to this kind of issue. It's now standard practice and mantra to just itemise what is seen as positives and so on, but not deal with the hard questions that are asked. Again, Taoiseach, they're not my words. That was what you said to the Taoiseach when he fobbed you off back in 2017, just like you just fobbed me off there. So I'll ask you again, can you please just deal with the questions that I've asked you? When will the Children's Disability Network teams be fully staffed? When will a new transport scheme be introduced? And am I to presume that that's a no on the ratification of the optional protocol? People have heard enough broken promises, enough itemisation of things like that. All they want are basic services, services the state has an obligation to provide, services that people have a right to. Is it really too much to ask to be prioritised rather than forgotten for somebody in government, for anybody, to act with urgency? You listed off a few things there. Your long-term priority of special education needs has amounted to precisely 0 special schools in Cork South West. You referenced Children's Disability Network teams. Not one of them are fully staffed. Pay parity for Section 39 workers, still not there.
Sorry, again, Deputy, I didn't fob you off.
Will you answer the question,
what I did do was challenge the assertions in your contribution that 0 had happened since the government came in. That's what you said in respect to special needs services generally. And I'm entitled to do that when you raise what I would believe to be a misleading presentation of the situation. That is not to say that I do not recognise that serious issues still remain, particularly in terms of access to therapies. I've consistently said that in this House, both in opposition and in government. And we'll continue to do that until I'm satisfied that there's a sufficiency of therapies available. It hasn't been from the want of political will or funding. The HSE have had a model for quite some time around progressing disability, which I've had issues with and which I believe has been problematic and, in my view, of a nature that has reduced children's access to therapies, whereas I want to increase children's access to therapies, particularly in terms of special schools. I answered your question in relation to CNDTs. I answered your questions in relation to the disability motorised scheme in terms of the work that's underway there, and in terms of the protocol government is examining that. But the more fundamental issue is to get services and to increase services.